Hello listeners and welcome to the Montel Weekly Podcast, bringing you energy matters in an informal setting. My name is Richard Sverrisson and today I'm joined by Antony Froggatt, Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House here in London. Welcome, Antony.
Thank you very much.
And by Chris Eales, Editor France at Montel. Hello, Chris.
Hello, thanks very much.
It's single denim today, is it?
This is.
Perfect.
Black.
Yeah. Today we're talking Brexit, and Antony, you're quite the expert on the matter and how it relates to energy. How do you view what's going on at the moment? I mean, obviously we've had the resignation of Theresa May, there's an election for a new leader of the Conservative Party. How is this playing out in terms of Brexit?
So as of Thursday morning, we are waiting for the first round of results for the leadership of the Conservative Party. And that is expected to, over the next week, whittle down from 10 down to 2 candidates. And then we'll have a month of the hustings amongst the membership of the Conservative Party. Indications are that one of those will be Boris Johnson, who is promoting strongly the view that we will leave in October, whatever happens, that's his pledge. We've heard those pledges before, obviously, from Conservative leaders, but there seems to be a reinvigoration of that view. We'll have to see who is the other candidate, and it may be that the other candidate has a slightly softer view about whether or not there's an opportunity to extend further if there were no deal. But it definitely seems to be the case that the likelihood of leaving with no deal is increasing. And obviously that has implications across a whole range of sectors on the whole of society. But from an energy perspective, I guess there's a number of areas that are of particular importance.
We could come back to that, Antony,
Okay.
I think, in particular detail about how the impact. But who do you think the other candidate's likely to be? And are they going to be going for a more softer Brexit, do you think? I mean, there's Rory Stewart, isn't there? He's more of a...
Yeah, I mean, I think there's 3 or 4 key candidates. I think what's likely is that what we'll see in the subsequent rounds is obviously reducing quite rapidly the number of candidates. And I think by the end of next week, we will probably maybe have 4 candidates, or middle of next week have 4 candidates that are still in the running. Jeremy Hunt being one, Rab being another, Boris Johnson, and possibly the Home Secretary as well. So that sort of combination, but I think moving from... It's unlikely we will see, I don't think, people like Rory Stewart who were talking about we won't leave under a no deal under any circumstances. I think it's almost certain he'll get knocked out in the round, and by the time this comes out, he will be out. So I think we're much more, in some ways, the view around May's deal being one end of the discussion with leaving no deal at the other. So not moving towards more compromise, I get the sense.
And of course, this is eating into valuable time as well, in terms of, ironing out parts of the deal or, the parliamentary process as well.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. One of the concerns that everyone had, even back starting at the beginning of the year, was the EU institutions have their sort of 4-year refresh. So obviously we've had the European elections. The Parliament is now reforming, the groups are reforming, but at the same time the Commission has to go through its new elections. So
that's by November, isn't it, when they'll be in place?
Yes, exactly. So what will happen is there will be elections for the head of the Commission, and then each member state will put forward their commissioners, and then these commissioners then put in draft positions by the new head of the Commission, and then you have parliamentary interviews or debates with, so whoever is being put forward to be the Energy Commissioner will go before the Parliament, and they will have a discussion with the Energy Committee of the Parliament. And then the Parliament as a whole has the right to either reject or accept the Commission. They can't take off individual commissioners. It's an all or one deal. So anyway, that, as you said, that goes on through to November. So there is institutional questions that are also on the European level that will slow down any future negotiations around the relationship. But what we've seen again is the Commission this week saying the withdrawal agreement is the only deal on the table.
And they're not likely to open up parts of that deal, are they?
They've said repeatedly that they won't. Whether or not if there is a new person in London, whether or not this significantly changes things, from my perspective, I don't see any indication that that's the case at the moment. But it's politics. So we sort of have to see what happens going forward.
Absolutely. If we can assume then that, there's an increased likelihood of a hard Brexit, so if we turn that to the energy sector, I mean, what does this mean for example, the wholesale market, and particularly, I think, on interconnectors, both gas and power?
Yeah, I mean, I think the interconnectors obviously are both from a sort of hardware perspective, but also from a regulatory perspective, the connection between the two markets. And so in terms of the electricity interconnectors, I think they are more important from a regulatory perspective, because what we're seeing as a process within the EU is a move towards more integration. And that is in part driven by policies and sort of ideology in terms of we want to have a more harmonised market across the EU, but also driven by necessity in terms of, as the EU seeks to decarbonise its electricity market, there is a greater percentage of renewable energy that's going onto the grid. In terms of the new capacity from renewables that's going on the grid, that is wind and solar, and that is a variable producer of electricity. So you need to have more flexibility in the grid to enable you to match both the production and demand and the wind. And so therefore interconnectors are really important to enable you to move electricity more freely. And that requires regulatory alignment. And that's sort of what we're seeing within the EU, is a move within the management of the interconnectors from a sort of day ahead market to one where you have intraday trading. And that's about regulatory alignment.
And it's all done implicitly as well.
Exactly. And so that's the way that we're moving. And so the question is, for the UK, as this process goes ahead, where does it engage? Does it wish to still be part of that train in some ways? And if so, that has implications in terms of the so-called being a rule taker, a rule setter, because those rules will be made in Brussels. They're made by a combination of the Commission, the Parliament, ENSO-E and ENSO-G in the case of gas. But in the case of ENSO-E, the UK will remain a member, but a less influential member. In the case of ENSO-G, it won't necessarily, because it is only for member states. Now, these are independent bodies, so they can change their rules. But there is this narrative, or has been a narrative going around Brussels for the last 2 years, is don't expect a special deal.
And look what's happened in Switzerland as well. Yeah, on the Swiss borders. I mean, that's, it's taken them however many years to even align their emissions trading scheme with that of the European one. So this is not a simple or straightforward or a quick process.
Yeah, and the Swiss case is really important from an electricity markets perspective in terms of Switzerland geographically in the centre of Europe with lots of hydro capacity, and the problems that they've had in terms of integrating into the European market compared to the UK on the edge of Europe. I mean, one is much more important for the European electricity market. And so they've had problems. And that's partly about domestic laws and about willingness to comply to the acquis, the European acquis. But it just indicates that a sector-by-sector approach, which is what the Swiss has, is problematic. And again, the case with the Switzerland has been affected by other political situations like the vote on immigration. That stopped all negotiations. So it's obviously a less sure situation going forward. But as I said, the UK has still even to decide what it wants. I mean, if we go back in terms of what the government had said in the past, in the various white papers and the Mansion House speech and all these other statements, the most recent one, which was around the political declaration, so the withdrawal agreement, and then you had the political declaration. And within that, they talked about the desire for there to be as efficient as trading as possible.
What does this mean, Anthony?
It's a question in some ways for the UK, is does it wish to seek to apply to be part of the internal energy market if there is a no-deal Brexit, then do they want to do a special sector deal for the connected industries, as it were, because there will be issues around data, issues about airlines, issues about electricity and gas, which are networked industries. So we want to continue to move these things around, and it's for the benefit of everyone, but under what rules and under what jurisdictions do those comply to? And so it may well be that we have to have a special deal around electricity and gas trading, which will, as I said, probably involve the UK having to accept the rules under potentially even the European Court of Justice for these particular sectors.
Yeah, that's not going to go.
What impact would that then have on the wholesale market? I mean, you have a no-deal Brexit, then and so all this has got to be renegotiated, basically. What would be the impact, do you think, on the flow of power across Europe?
I mean, I think it's still going to happen. And I think there are, prior to sort of the end of March, there was the countries where you had interconnectors like the Netherlands were changing domestic legislation to enable them to continue to trade electricity because they would be then trading with it with a non-member state. So they were preparing for a no-deal agreement. And so in that way, certain things were put in place beforehand and they will still apply should we leave with the no deal in October. I think it's, in some ways, the question is more going forward as things integrate more, then where does the UK continue to be engaged within that? And I guess probably the worst case scenario is that trading becomes less efficient because you're no longer able to do, or you're not able to trade at such a flexible way. Therefore, the value of the interconnectors goes down because you can't capitalize on market different prices, different.
The arbitrage, yeah.
Yes, you can't rely on that because you can't capture it on the short term. So therefore, the economics of interconnectors is less viable. And so, given the fact that the UK has sort of 4 or 5 gigawatts, it has 4 gigawatts under capacity, another which is being commissioned. But the idea was that they would then build maybe up to another 10 gigawatts. So there's various Norwegian ones that are being proposed, there's Danish, there's more to France, Netherlands, even to Iceland. If the economic value that they can the revenues that they can raise are less, then maybe they're less likely to be built. And so if we think the idea behind the move towards a more flexible power sector is important to decarbonise, and you can't have the interconnectors operating in the most flexible way, then that, I think, is to the detrimental of the system as a whole, not just in terms of the operation of the interconnectors.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, some of these interconnectors are already being built, like the one from Norway. Maybe initially they were built under the assumption that there would not be a Brexit and that the UK would be part of the internal energy market. Now that's changing. But I'm just wondering, Antony, in terms of the flows, the power and gas, are we likely to see the imposition of tariffs on imports and potentially exports as well of energy?
I don't think it's a tariff issue. I mean, I think in terms of electricity, under WTO rules, electricity doesn't have any.
Okay.
And gas is like 0.7%. So
Okay.
it's not a significant, it's the non-tariff barriers that are much more important than the tariffs.
Okay, that's quite unlikely. So, Antony, you mentioned about the UK potentially not being part of ENTSO-G under a hard Brexit. How about the access to other regional initiatives in Europe, and as well as funding from the European Investment Bank?
There's a wide range of different funding that the UK currently gets for the energy sector. So structural funds is obviously in certain parts of the UK is quite significant. Research and development, both of which are grants. But then there's the European Investment Bank, which has been a significant funder of UK infrastructure, including energy, over the last decades. We know, I mean, you can see in terms of the projects that are commissioned. So the EIB does fund to non-member states, but 80% of its funding goes to member states. And already you've seen basically a significant shift in terms of new projects and the level of funding. So before the deal, you saw in the billions of projects that were funded in the UK, and that's fallen to hundreds of millions. So it's sort of a order of magnitude sort of difference per year in terms of projects.
So it's already having an effect,
because projects are just not being taken forward.
Yeah.
Interesting things like there's the Connecting Europe facility, which is designed to develop interconnectors. And the UK is still getting, I mean, these are small funding. These are sort of tens of millions project development finance. But because they are obviously connecting to other member states, then they're still they're still applied. So there is still some money, but it's significantly reduced. So I think from a financial perspective, it's going to be very interesting. And in terms of research and development, then the government has pledged to match the European levels of European funding through until 2020. But that's very short term. And so the question sort of will be for the UK, will it buy into research and development, the EU's framework programme? So the next round starts in 2020. It's possible for non-member states to be part of it, but you put in what you get. So
What about Hinkley Point and the state aid question? What will be the impact? What could be the impact on the state aid case, or the state aid that's been agreed for Hinkley Point, for the nuclear power plant that's being built in South West England?
Potentially the next round of...
I would argue that it's potentially more problematic for the UK outside of the EU on state aid rules than in it, which might be go against
interesting
thinking. My logic being that many of these are really political decisions. And so what happens is a government says we want to do this, and there's lots of lobbying that goes on, and there's political influence. Even though it's the European Court, I would argue that it's political. And so the UK, if you would argue for Hinkley, wasn't a bad deal that they got through. £92 a megawatt hour, index linked. I mean, everyone now is looking at that and going, that's a bit generous. So they got what they wanted in order to get it through. Outside of the EU, if we want to be part of the internal energy market, then we're going to have to apply by the same rules. And the Parliament has, at time and time again, has said that's about environmental protection, it's about market rules, etc., etc. But we will have less political influence. So maybe when we come round to future reactors, they will have to comply by state aid rules, but be less influential within the decision making.
Okay.
But if we see what's happened to date, the UK government has, on terms of the energy sector, got what it wanted. Brussels hasn't been an impediment to giving the industry the support structures that it wanted to.
Some would even argue that it's been fairly weak in terms of state aid more generally. It's very rarely laid down.
There's not many cases where they've said no. There's been some where you might have to adjust things.
Exactly.
But as I said, in terms of the current view really of what Hinkley was, outside of EDF and Bayes, there's nobody who thinks that this is a really good deal for the consumer.
Bayes being the ministry, basically, the Department for Energy.
So and other people, even the nuclear industry themselves, look at this and actually go, this isn't a good thing, because in some ways what's happened with the future reactor, so the Hitachi and the Toshiba reactor, in particular in the case of Hitachi, they were probably looking for a contract for difference of around £92 a megawatt hour, becomes the benchmark. And the government's basically saying, no, we're not doing that again. We realised that was too high. And so that has created problems, and they've walked away. So it's obviously not that simple, but I don't think that it was a good deal for anyone in terms of the strike price that's so high.
Absolutely. In terms of the internal energy market, I mean, that's the key question, in or out. If you're in, do you then have to abide by or be under the European Court of Justice? That would be part of being, in terms of the IEM.
There may be, you could look to the EA countries that are part of the internal energy market. They have their own, so the European Economic Area countries, so like Norway, Liechtenstein,
and Iceland.
So they have their own arbitration system. But so there is the potential.
EFTA supervisory board.
Exactly. So they have an opportunity to have a slightly different system, but of course it's linked. And the Swiss have a bilateral agreement. So there'll have to be some sort of legal framework in some ways, but the obvious one for the UK in some ways is the European Court of Justice or some variation of that, because it's a known system. But there has to be some arbitration, and that we'll have to see what that is.
In the case of Ireland, I think that's quite an interesting example. I mean, the single Irish market was launched last year. What would Brexit do to this? I mean, would you have to look at a completely different regulatory oversight or another kind of regime? What do you see happening here?
I mean, again, I think it's a question of the governance structure. As you said, there is a joint regulatory body from North and Southern Ireland that oversees the operation of the market, and that operates under European rules. So the options open to them are either you continue that market and there's an allowance that Northern Ireland continues to apply to the internal energy market rules, or they have to have some special agreement with the Commission that enables them to continue not applying by it but staying part of the market. So again, it's not really clear how this is going to be resolved, except in some ways it is the problems that the rest of the UK faces with the continental market, but at a much more detailed level, because the integration of the systems is so much more. And so, it's a problem. And I think in particular, probably going forward with the governance systems, it's much more of a challenge.
Yeah. And I mean, if return to what you said previously, well, it's more inefficiencies and cost would probably rise.
So nobody is saying that they want to undo that, or not many people are saying they want to undo the ISM. They want to continue that process. And you said it's been launched very recently. So it remains a problem that people recognise that the Irish question is fundamental to the future, and therefore the electricity and the sort of ICM hasn't really been top of the political agenda, but there's lots of people who are closely following this and aware that it is a problem.
If you turn it around, Anthony, and look at, the UK's been quite a driver within Europe to look at, to focus more on market-based policy. How do you see Europe evolving without that influence from the UK? Will we see a Europe that becomes more interventionist, or what's the impact there? The other way around?
Yeah, no, it's a very important question, and I think within the energy sector, there's a couple of areas that are obviously most obvious initially. I think one probably is climate change. So the UK has been a strong promoter of ambitious climate change targets within the EU. In terms of EU legislation, it has to go through a number of steps. So you have the Parliament, where the UK obviously has representation. It has 60 or 70 MEPs out of the 500 or 600. But it's within the Council, the European Council, which is made up of each member state. But on some issues, it's one state, one vote. But on other issues, it's under qualified majority, whereby the importance of a country is based on its population. So the UK has a larger population, has a larger share, say, than Luxembourg or Belgium. And so it's coming out of that discussion, or no longer being part of that, has a more of a significant impact, I would argue, than, say, it no longer being in the European Parliament because of the weight. But on climate, we will potentially, as a strong voice, many countries coalesced around the UK. So it's interesting. We talked to, for example, some people in Sweden who were saying, well, they really notice or have started to think about this as an issue because before, they would rely on the UK, and then they could take the UK's position and they would support the UK. So who will now be that champion that other people will coalesce around?
That's very interesting.
It is
interesting. Very interesting,
But the other interesting thing, which, as an aside, you may know, is they talked about language, is the importance of the English language will change. So, for example, for the Swedish diplomats, English is obviously really important.
They'll have to learn French, maybe.
Exactly. Yeah. Because the more...
Quelle horreur, exactly, yeah. So, or German,
In terms of the negotiation language, a lot of it is done in English. But that may be, over time, that may change because the language skills of the people that are coming in, it's less important. Obviously, Irish, you saw, but it's just in terms of the interesting elements that you don't really think about initially that may have a knock-on impact.
That's very interesting.
So anyway, I think in terms of climate change, it's quite important. But also nuclear is probably, I think, from a numbers perspective, is the most dramatic, because the UK, in some ways, nuclear is more black and white. I mean, it's not, but you have countries that have nuclear and countries that don't have nuclear, and the way that they vote within the council is largely dependent on that. And if you look at the change in the voting patterns, it may make a difference, the UK being out, in terms of whether or not the strongly pro-nuclear countries will be able to push things through. I mean, it's never that simple.
But nuclear was UK is a champion of nuclear.
Exactly.
So it's going to boost the case of renewables, are you saying?
Well, I think it will probably reduce within the council at least, and the nuclear industry have referred to this, it will make it less likely that strongly pro-nuclear legislation will be passed through the council. Does that lead to more support for renewables? I don't know, but anyway, it's just interesting as a thought that
it's losing an influential voice in the nuclear lobby.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So, in other areas, the UK has been seen as a bit of a balancer between the French and German axis, really. And I think across lots of different sectors, people have thought that this may be an issue, is that they maybe the sort of becomes much more controlled by the French and Germans going forward.
Do you think anything good will come of Brexit? What are the opportunities for the energy sector? And we've talked mainly about the negative impacts. I mean, some people must be thinking there's an opportunity for maybe cross-border trading here, or I don't know, importing more LNG from certain areas. I mean, what's your view?
Firstly, I think there doesn't have to be an upside from an energy perspective. It wasn't like the referendum was voted on because of energy. So I would argue that it wasn't really part of the discourse. So, but there are obviously things that change. It's not all going to be negative, but I think that the positive things might be the development for the UK, at least, of more regional approaches. And I think it might be that in particular with Norway, I think the relationship with Norway will be very important, both from a electricity trade perspective going forward, but also in terms of dependence on fossil fuel production, offshore wind, all of these other areas. So there's the North Sea Grid Initiative, which has developed under the EU, but the UK is likely to continue to be engaged within that. And I think developing a grid initiative and a gas initiative that includes Ireland, UK, Norway, maybe Germany, etc., to have a strong offshore development would be very positive. I think that there's other areas, and one of the questions that we've raised in the past is there is the UK at one side in some ways looking to leave the EU. There's also countries that are looking to enter the EU. So through the energy community, European Energy Community, they're complying with their acquis. So they're changing their rules in order to meet the EU's acquis. Whether or not the body of legislation, the European body of legislation. So although there are different ends in some ways of the EU, will the UK seek to work in some ways with other neighbourhood countries in a positive way? Because I would argue that what we're seeing is a more integrated EU from an energy and from a climate perspective. But that shouldn't just be restricted to the member states. It is a continental issue. And as you're moving electricity to Ukraine, Baltic states, Turkey, etc., then having, in the same way that we've talked about in terms of the interconnectors, having a more harmonised market across a wider continent is to the advantage of everyone. So whether or not the UK plays a role within that, I think, I would argue that it probably should play a role.
I mean, Antony, we could go on, I think, for hours, and I feel we've only really scratched the surface, really, of all matters Brexit. But thank you very much for joining the Montel podcast. It's been a pleasure having you. I hope we can chat again, maybe after Brexit, and follow up. So thank you, Antony. Please follow all the latest developments on montelnews.com and follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. We're back next week. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.